Hello! Last time I promised you two things. One is that this time we would be talking about some of the ways in which markets might produce results that are not efficient. And the other was that I would continue to hawk my book. Here it is. It's a step-by-step guide to the principles of microeconomics. It will help you answer many of the questions that you have in your own Principles of Micro course, unless, of course, you're already in my class and it's been assigned to you, and you already know how helpful it is. How about that? So let's get to market failure. So far in discussing markets, we've really come down pretty heavily on the side of competitive markets being the way to allocate stuff, right? If you want to have a problem that you want to allocate tasks to people, or rather you want to figure out what stuff is going to get made and who's going to get the stuff, how do you answer that question? Well, you will use a competitive market to do it. That's the most efficient way to use your resources. And everything that we've covered up so far has really backed that up. And it is a pretty strong result. And most of the time, you talk to an economist, they'll say that a competitive market is going to be the most efficient way to allocate resources. However, it's never quite that simple, and there are, of course, going to be some exceptions in which markets are not just going to produce efficient results that we don't like. So, for example, it's a perfectly efficient result, for say to have heavy amounts of income inequality, which we might not like, but perfectly efficient. We may not like that, but that's not what we're talking about. We're specifically talking about ways in which the market will produce results that are not efficient, right? You have a perfectly competitive market. It's not a monopoly or anything like that. It's perfectly competitive. And it's not that we don't like efficiency, it's that we're not getting efficiency. That's what we mean by market failure. The market is failing to do the thing that it's supposed to do, which is provide an efficient result. So this can happen because the market is not competitive, right? We'll get to monopolies and stuff like that later. But it can also happen when there are other things that are actually features of the market or the good itself. And if you ask an economist, is regulation of a market justified? Often they will look for whether one of these things is present. And so these things are in two primary forms. One is externalities, and the other is two features of goods themselves called rivalry and excludability. We're going to get to each of these in turn. We're going to start with externalities. So externalities are about this. When you graph out a supply and demand curve, and we've said that each supply curve and demand curve represents thousands of little people, each of them a little tiny dot on the line somewhere on that curve. However, those graphs include a lot of people, but they don't include everybody. There are some people who are simply not in the market whatsoever. And those people really have no say in terms of how much of a good is going to get produced and consumed. Now, that's not usually a problem. However, there are some goods that have what are called externalities. And an externality occurs whenever the size of the market, specifically the quantity of goods that are produced, has an effect on people who are not in the market. This could be a positive effect or this could be a negative effect. But the important thing is that the decision of whether or not to make and buy the good is being made by somebody other than the people who are actually being affected by this. Somebody's being affected by it who does not have a say in the process. And what this means, this could be any kind of effect, and what this means is that somebody is going to be hurt by a decision that is being made by people who are not taking their preferences into account. When I'm deciding to buy or sell a good, I don't necessarily take into account all the harm that buying this good might do. Right? If I'm only thinking about my own marginal benefit or my own marginal costs, I'm not including in that list of marginal benefit and marginal cost the marginal costs and marginal benefits that other people get. And when I don't do that, there might be some cost that I am not paying attention to, but is in fact a real cost. It's just not a cost that goes to me. And by not paying attention to it, that means that I'm not properly considering all of the costs and benefits of my decision, which unsurprisingly is going to lead me to a decision that does not maximize total surplus. And this is, of course, going to go along with any situation where somebody's making a decision that affects somebody else. They might not take that somebody else into account entirely that we might want them to. And they're not going to incorporate those preferences into their decision. And so those benefits or those costs will not be what are called internalized. If I'm making a decision that's going to harm you, and I'm not feeling the same level of pain that you are, then I'm not going to make the decision right. That is, if I'm not internalizing all of the pain that it's causing you, I'm not going to react to that pain as strongly as if it were mine. And so I'm not going to take into account all of the damage that it could be doing. And this creates, of course, some tension, right? Whenever you have somebody making a decision that hurts somebody else, which is what externalities are, if they're negative externalities, they hurt, then we're not going to end up with great decisions. Now, a very clear example of externalities, and the first example that any economist is going to point to as an externality, is pollution. And so let's take this as an example. Pollution occurs when in the production of some goods. There are plenty of goods, say the rubber in tires, or plenty of certain chemicals that get synthesized or produced that harm other people or the environment as a result of their production. Right? It puts smoke into the air, it degrades the quality of the water, whatever it is. And if you live in that area, you're going to get hurt by that production, whether or not you're actually a buyer or seller of those goods. Right? It's causing harm to people outside of the market, which is exactly what we're looking for with an externality. Now, this external cost, this is an external cost that's being levied on the people who are external to the market, right? People who are outside the market are the ones who are bearing these costs, right? The people who have to drink the water that has been polluted by the factory that put a bunch of chemicals in there, right? They are external to the market. They're not producing those chemicals. They may not be buying those chemicals, but they are being affected by the production. And that's called an external cost or a social cost. And in order to fix this problem, in order to get the factory to make an amount of whatever they're making that is efficient, we need them to basically be responsible for all of the harms that they are producing. So basically, in order for the factory to make a good decision about how much of this stuff they should be making, they need to feel the pain that everybody else feels, right? They need to internalize that externality. Now, this leads us to the idea of what's called social marginal cost. Now, we've done plenty of stuff about marginal cost before, and this is just marginal social cost is not just the marginal cost that goes to the person producing the good, it's the marginal cost that goes to everybody, both the people who produce the good and the external people who are affected by it. So the marginal social cost is the private cost plus the cost imposed on the rest of society. So marginal social cost is private cost plus external costs. And so this is basically the additional amount that the society must pay as a whole whenever one more unit of the good is produced. And we can sort of stack this on top of the private cost. We can stack those external costs on top of the private costs. And so you can imagine marginal social cost is just sort of sitting on top of the supply curve, a little bit above it, right? Representing both the marginal cost that the supply curve represents, and then adding on top of that some external cost, the cost that that unit imposes on others. And we end up with our marginal social cost. For a similar idea, we have marginal social benefit, right? Not all externalities have to be negative. You can imagine some goods that the production of which actually helps other people who are not a part of the market. A very basic example might be something like a gardener. If you buy a gardener's services, right, they're selling you the services, you're buying the services, but everybody who walks by your house gets to look at the nice flowers. And so those gardening services have a positive externality. And so there is a marginal social benefit above and beyond what you see in the demand curve. And just like marginal social cost, marginal social benefit is equal to private benefit plus external benefit. And so just like with marginal social cost, we can start with our demand curve, and on top of it we can lump those external benefits, and so we end up with a marginal social benefit that's just sort of sitting on top of that demand curve. Right? The difference between the two being the external benefits that we add in to get to the marginal social benefit. Now this sort of reorients our idea of what efficiency is in the first place, right? We've talked about efficiency basically coming about when marginal cost equals marginal benefit at a societal level before, but now we need to think about the fact that at a societal level includes people who aren't in the market. So we still want to set marginal cost equal to marginal benefit, but we really want to do it for everybody all at once, which means that we want to set marginal social cost equal to marginal social benefit. It's the same idea as before, just applied in a slightly different way, just remembering that those external costs are still there. And this gives us back to the golden rule that we've talked about a million times, right? This is just now the golden rule for society as a whole. You want marginal social cost to equal marginal social benefit. And when there are external costs or benefits, that's not going to be quite the same as what you get from a competitive market, which means that the quantity chosen by the market is not going to be the same as the efficient quantity, which gets us to that exact thing that we were talking about with market failure, where the market is going to produce a result that is not efficient. It's not just that we don't like it, it's that it's not even efficient. It's not the most effective use of our resources. So that polluting factory, for example, if it doesn't have to pay attention to those external costs, it's going to produce a whole bunch of stuff, not caring about the damage that it's causing, even though it would be efficient to produce less of it, right? The benefits from producing it, and there certainly are benefits to whatever they're producing in that factory, would meet the marginal social costs at a lower quantity. It's not worth producing quite as much of it as it is before. We can graph these things out. So we know that the optimal quantity is going to come where marginal social cost meets marginal social benefit, right? Just as though they were supply and demand curves, we look for where they cross. That's going to give us our optimal quantity. I'm going to call that QO for optimal, all right? We can imagine what this might be looking like if we also had supply and demand on there. Now remember, supply and demand, those are going to be below the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit. Now not always, they might be the exact same if there's no external benefit, right? If nobody is affected by you producing a good, then there are no external costs, just private costs. And in that case, marginal social cost is equal to marginal to the supply curve. But here we're going to say that there are both external costs and external benefits. So we're going to draw supply below the marginal social cost, and we're going to draw demand below the marginal social benefit. Now the quantity that's actually going to get chosen in the market is going to be where supply and demand cross. But as you can see here, that is not equal to the optimal quantity. In fact, here we are producing too much. Right, the quantity produced in the competitive market, I'm going to call that QC for competitive, is above the quantity that we get in the optimal amount. And we can figure out, well, what is our deadweight loss? We're actually going to get a deadweight loss in a competitive market here. And just as always, it's going to be the area between the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit over the units that we shouldn't be producing anymore. So we get this triangle in here, and that represents our deadweight loss. Whenever we have a loss of efficiency, there's always going to be a deadweight loss hanging around somewhere, because it's just a description of how much surplus did we lose, how far off are we from optimal efficiency. And we have this overproduction result here, and this we can think about whether it's going to be high or low. There's sort of a rule of thumb. Basically, if you're talking about a good where it's mostly negative externalities, where it mostly hurts people rather than helping other external people, you're going to produce too much of it, which makes sense, right? Basically, there's a cost out there that you're not paying attention to, so you're going to keep producing willy-nilly as though that cost weren't there, as though it was cheaper than it really is. Similarly, if it's a good that mostly produces positive benefits to other people, if it has a positive externality, you're going to underproduce it in a competitive market, right? There's a whole benefit out there that you're not taking advantage of, or that you're not paying attention to, and so you're going to buy as though that benefit weren't even there. You're going to think that the benefit is not as high as it actually is, and so you're going to buy fewer units. You're not going to buy quite enough. Let's do a quick example of working through the optimal quantity and the market quantity here. So let's say that we have a demand curve of price equals 100 minus QD, and we have a supply curve of price equals 20 plus QS. We have a marginal social cost of 60 plus Q, and we have a marginal social benefit of 100 minus Q. Now the first thing to notice here is that the demand curve is the exact same as the marginal social benefit. And what this is saying is that there's no external benefits here, right? Nobody is benefiting unless they're actually the ones getting the good. There's no external benefit. But there is an external cost. That supply curve and the marginal social cost are not the same thing. In fact, the marginal social cost is considerably above the supply curve, indicating that there is a harm being produced by this good. So are we going to end up with the optimal quantity being above or below the quantity that we're going to get in the market? There's a cost we're not paying attention to, so we're going to end up producing too much. The competitive market quantity is going to be above the optimal quantity. Let's actually work this out numerically. What is the market quantity going to be? We can solve that just as we always have. We have 100 minus Q star equals 20 plus Q star. That gives us 80 equals 2Q star, or 40 equals Q star. So our optimal, or our market quantity, Q star, QC, is 40. Well, what's the optimal quantity? Well, we just set marginal social cost equal to marginal social benefit, which gives us 60 plus Q equals 100 minus Q, or 2Q equals 40, or Q equals 20. That's our optimal quantity, QO. So the optimal quantity is 20, but instead of producing the optimal efficient quantity, we went ahead and produced 40. We produced too much because we were not paying attention and thinking about those external costs. Now, pollution is, of course, a very easy example of an external cost, and maybe this whole market that we just did here is for some good that produces pollution. Positive externalities are a little bit harder to think of. I gave the example of a gardener, but also just attractive looking houses in general. Bees have a positive externality, right? If you have a hive for bees that will pollinate nearby flowers, even if you don't own those flowers. Research and development has positive externalities. If you develop an idea, then other people might be able to use that idea as well, even if they didn't pay for it in the first place. Health insurance is an example of something that has a positive externality if you're a healthy person, because it tends to lower the rates for other people if you are healthy and you buy health insurance. One particular example of something that has positive externalities is education. And we're going to take this example and use it to separate out these ideas of private and external costs. And social, we're going to also call those social costs. So let's think about education. And we're going to separate this out into private costs, social costs, private benefits, and social benefits. Okay, so what are the private costs and private benefits of education? Well, the private costs, of course, are going to include things like tuition. Let's say we're talking about college here, so tuition you're going to have to pay. It's going to take up your time. And maybe there's going to be some psychic cost. It will be difficult for you to get through education. Psychic cost. And in case you're curious, yes, psychic cost is the term that researchers use to refer to that term. Okay, how about the private benefits? Well, you earn more money as a result of getting your college degree. You're going to earn more money. You might meet some nice people. Heck, maybe you'll enjoy the experience of education. Okay. What about the social cost and social benefit? What cost does you going to an education impose on other people who had nothing to do with the decision? Well, people pay their taxes, of course. And so that pays to subsidize your education. So by going to get an education, you sort of impose those taxation costs on people. By getting an education, it might make it harder for people without one to get a job. So lower wages, perhaps, or competition. So those are some social costs. How about the social benefits? Well, by going to get education, it helps certain industries develop, which helps the economy grow overall. It also provides other benefits. It can have the transmission of knowledge. But if you know a bunch of stuff, you can tell other people about it. So we have social costs and we have social benefits. So there's certainly both social costs and external costs and external benefits to education. Now, if you ask a lot of people, I think they would probably say that this area over here, the social benefits, are probably worth a bit more than the social costs. So this is an example of a good for which the social benefits, the external benefits, are going to outweigh the external costs. So let's think back, is this going to be overproduced or underproduced if we just had a competitive market for college education? Well, if it's mostly positive external benefits, then that means that we are going to underproduce it. Now, what that means is that if we took away all the subsidies, all the tax subsidies, all of the government provision of education, what we'd end up with is you'd only get an education if it's worth it to you to pay the tuition and spend your time, and people would only provide you an education if they could do it without a subsidy. And what this whole thing is suggesting is that probably in that world, fewer people get educated than is worth it to educate. That there are people out there for whom the benefits to society of educating them would outweigh the costs, but they wouldn't get educated because they would not be able to realize those costs and those benefits especially. And that's sort of the distinction that we have. It's not that the market won't work, it's just that we're going to produce the wrong amount because we're not taking into account those benefits and costs that accrue to other people. So, to sort of sum up the whole thing about externalities, you have an externality whenever the production of a good affects other people, either positively or negatively. And because you don't care about those costs that you're imposing, you're going to set your own marginal cost equal to marginal benefit. But it's not going to be the marginal cost equal to marginal benefit for the entirety of society. So in order to get the real, true, efficient result, you need to set marginal social cost equal to marginal social benefit. And whether or not the competitive market on its own would overproduce or underproduce a good relative to that efficient quantity depends on how many external costs there are and how many external benefits. So that's externalities. But as I said in the beginning, there's going to be some other criteria that we're going to want to look at, specifically things called rivalry and excludability. And now what these are is these are ways of basically classifying goods. The goods themselves, in the same way that the externalities are about the goods themselves having effects on other people, here this is about the ways that the goods themselves sort of lend themselves to being in a market itself. Like how well would the market for these goods actually sort of function? And it comes down to these two things, rivalry and excludability. Let's talk about excludability first. So by definition, a good that is excludable is one for which you can stop people from using it if they don't pay. Whereas a good that is non-excludable, you can't stop them from using it even if they don't pay. So basically, it's hard to actually get people to need to pay for this good, right? You can't stop them from using it, basically. So one example of this is fireworks. So around here, they have the Disneyland fireworks every night. And if you are close enough to Disneyland, you can see the fireworks, even if you're not in Disneyland. And they can't stop you, right? They can't walk around all of Anaheim charging people money if they happen to be looking in the direction of the fireworks. It's just simply not possible. And so fireworks are an example of something that is non-excludable. Even if you want to, you can't charge people to use it. On the other hand, Disneyland can charge people to use the rides. You can't just walk into Disneyland and start riding a ride. They will be able to keep you from using it if you haven't paid. So that is an example of something that is excludable because they can stop you from using it if you haven't paid for it. Let's go to the definition also of something being rival in consumption. Something is rival in consumption if you using it means that there's less left over for somebody else. Whereas if something is non-rival, that means that you using it does not really deplete it in any way. It means that there's still the same amount left over for everybody else as there was before, right? Basically, everybody can share the exact same unit without using it up. So one example of something that is non-rival in consumption is national defense. If the army is around, right, and they are protecting you from being invaded, well, you being protected from invasion does not make me less protected from invasion, right? They're providing the same protection to both of us at the same time. We're both using the same unit of national defense as each other at the same time. We're not getting in each other's way. We're not rivals in consuming that particular thing. Whereas something that is rival in consumption would be most physical goods, right? For example, a slice of pizza. If you eat a slice of pizza, I cannot eat that same slice of pizza. We can't both eat the same slice of pizza. That's not how food works. So we have two things. We have rivalry in consumption. Things can either be rival or not. And we have excludability. Things can either be excludable or not. When you combine those two together, we end up with 4 different kinds of goods. And we're going to go over each of those goods. These are going to be the important things. And each of these kinds of goods relate to the idea of markets and the idea of being traded in a market in very different ways. And some of these markets are not going to produce efficient results for us. So the first one we're going to talk about is when you have something that is both rival and excludable. So we're going to make ourselves a little table. We're going to have rival on the top, and we're going to have excludable on the left. That'd be excludable or not. You can either be rival or not. And in the yes and yes, both rival and excludable, we have something called private goods. Private goods are basically all the kinds of goods that we've been talking about in this class up to this point. All the standard stuff. Lamps, tables, cars, everything that, I can stop you from taking a lamp if you haven't paid for it, right? I can get my security guard to stop you. And it's excludable. I can't have the same lamp in my house that you have in yours. I could have another copy of that lamp, but I can't literally have the same lamp in my house, because then it wouldn't be in your house. So this one's easy. We've already been covering it for weeks and weeks and weeks, so we're going to forget that, and we're going to move on to the next one, which is goods that are excludable but not rivalrous. These are what are called artificially scarce goods. They're also called club goods sometimes. So what an artificially scarce good is basically, well, think about it. Well, what do we have? Okay, so it's excludable, so I can stop you from using it, but it's not rival, which means that if I did let you use it, I would still have just as much as I started with. There's actually a lot of these kind of goods, even though it's a little bit hard to think about. Once I give you an example, I think it's going to be clear. And the example is pretty much every single thing that you can download is an artificially scarce good. Well, think about it. First of all, I can stop you from downloading something if you haven't paid for it, right? That's what a paywall is all about, right? I can stop you from downloading the newest video game if you haven't paid me the money. I have the ability to stop you. However, it's not rival. Copying another copy of the song or the game or the movie or whatever is basically free. It doesn't really cost anything. It doesn't leave any less over for somebody else. So it's not rival. Once the thing is there to be shared in the first place, making another copy is basically costless. Now, the way that many of these things, then you can imagine sort of how this might lead itself to a certain kind of inefficient consumption, specifically inefficiently low consumption. Think about what efficiency is in pretty much all the contexts that we've looked at it. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost. Now, what is the marginal cost of producing another unit of one of these goods? It's zero. It's basically free. It doesn't cost anything to make another unit because, or at least to let you use another unit, because it's free to copy, right? It doesn't cost me anything. So if the marginal cost is zero, what is the efficient marginal benefit, or the efficient price? It's also zero. So the efficient price for one of these goods is zero. But because I can keep you from using it unless you pay, I'm not going to make you pay zero. I'm not going to pick a price of zero. I'm going to make you pay more than that. So we're going to definitely end up with a price above zero, but the efficient price is zero. And so we know that we're going to be having a price that's inefficiently high and a quantity that is inefficiently low. So we have inefficiently low consumption as a result of these artificially scarce goods, just basically because of the kind of good that they are. Now, in this case, that doesn't necessarily mean that the paywall is a bad thing. Right? After all, it's free to provide another unit of these goods, but they're not free to create in the first place. It takes time and effort and energy to write and record a song, even if giving away another copy of the song doesn't actually cost you anything. So if the paywall did not exist, then nobody would be making the goods to give out in the first place, and that wouldn't be any good either. So surprisingly, getting to our efficient price would mean that the good wouldn't exist in the first place, because nobody would bother to pay the fixed costs of producing the good. So how do we deal with this? That's a problem, right? So the efficient result is also a bad result because the market doesn't exist in the first place. Again, keeping in mind that that's the efficient result once the good has been created. So how do we figure this out? Well, one way that this is often dealt with is related to the fact that these are sometimes called club goods. One of the efficient ways that you can provide one of these goods is charge people a fee up front and then give them access to as many of these goods as they want. So, for example, if I make you pay an upfront fee and then I give you access to a library of stuff and then I charge you nothing to use all of that stuff, well, what's the price of using a unit of the good? It's zero, which is that efficient price that we wanted. But because we charged a paywall fee up front, we still paid the producer, which gave them the money necessary to produce the good in the first place. So that sort of solves our problem. Which actually brings us to an interesting point. Think about this for a second. Which of these two companies was more efficient in producing music? iTunes or Spotify, right? iTunes charged you by the song but did not charge an upfront fee. Spotify charges you an upfront fee but does not charge you to listen to another song. Well, thinking about how we have it here, the efficient company is Spotify. The marginal cost of letting you listen to another song is zero. even if Spotify has to pay somebody else to do that, right? They have to pay a couple cents to the artists, producers, right? The actual cost of producing another file is zero, no matter who the money is going to. So by matching that actual price of zero, Spotify has made the provision of music efficient, whereas iTunes was charging a price per song, which doesn't make any sense because it doesn't cost anything to produce another song. So by moving from a world where iTunes was the dominant way people got music to a world where Spotify is the dominant way that people got music, we made the world more efficient. So that's a good thing. So let's move on. We've done artificially scarce goods. Let's talk about goods that are rival but not excludable. These are called commons goods. Now think about what this means if it's rival but not excludable. That means that I can't stop you from using it, but if you do use it, it uses it up. So you can sort of imagine how this might go. Imagine that there's a good out there that everyone has free access to, but it gets used up. Well, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go in there and you're going to use it immediately so that you can use it before everybody else uses it and it goes away, because then you'd be left with nothing. So everyone's going to rush in and use it right away, which means that it's going to fritter away to nothing immediately. And that's bad. Obviously, that's going to be inefficient as well. And specifically, it's going to be inefficiently high consumption. Everyone's going to rush in and use this good because they want to make sure they can use it before it goes away. And we're going to consume too much of it. Now, one example of something like this is if you ever put out a bowl of candy on your front porch step for Halloween. That is a good that everyone has access to. If you're not watching it, right, anybody can take as much candy as they want, and it is rival. So if somebody takes candy, somebody else can't take the same, which is why you often end up with some enterprising teenager coming along and just dumping the entire bowl into their sack, the inefficiently high consumption. But there are more dire examples of this too. A lot of natural resources are like this if there isn't something limiting the access that people can have to them. So for example, fish stocks in the ocean. There's only so much fish in the ocean. If you fish too much, it's going to use up the fish basically, and it's not going to be sustainable, and they're going to go away. So it's a rival in consumption. But if you're in a part of the world, if you're in a part of the ocean where there's not any rules about fishing or fishing licenses required, then it's not excludable. You can't stop people from fishing. And so fish get overfished, which is exactly what happens. And the fish stocks dwindle, inefficiently high consumption. Same thing happens with forestry, right? People are, if there's no forestry license, you can just chop down a tree and take it whenever you want. People are going to rush in and take as many trees as they can before they run out. And then we're going to end up without a forest. So obviously this is a problem that we run into quite a bit. You can sort of think through this example in sort of the very classic example of the tragedy of the commons, which is what this is named after. So it used to be the case that there were things called commons, where it was common farmland that anybody could use, which of course meant that it was, you could think about, well, how nicely am I going to treat this land? Am I going to use it up as quickly as I can? Put in a bunch of crops that are just going to drain the soil, or bring in a bunch of cows that are going to, eat it all up? Or am I going to try to use it sustainably? Well, unsurprisingly, you might suspect that people are going to use it up real quick. So let's imagine that we have a group of 5 farmers and they have this common land for grazing cows. Now the land has enough grass to sustainably support 20 cows. If you bring 20 cows to graze, then it'll be fine. But then one farmer might think, well, hold on. If every one of us brings 4 cows each, that's 20 cows, fine. But what if my neighbor brings a 5th cow? Then there's 21 cows, and then the land's not going to be sustainable, and there's going to be less grass left over for my cows next year. Well, if he does that, then I'm going to be screwed next year. I better get all my cows in right now. I'm going to bring my own 5th cow. Everybody's going to think that. Everybody's going to bring 5 cows, and then maybe everyone will bring 6 cows, and then everybody will bring 7 cows, and then suddenly the grass is gone, and the commons land doesn't work anymore. So that's not going to work out too well. Now, unsurprisingly, having a commons goods system leads us to overconsume these goods, which can lead to lots of environmental type problems. Now, this is an interesting example as well because of the tension that we mentioned last time between efficiency and something like equality. So if you ask an economist, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve the problem of commons goods, that they're going to get overconsumed? Well, a lot of economists would say, well, you give that commons good to somebody and you make it theirs. And then it becomes in their interest to make sure that it's sustainably used because they own it, right? And those future returns, right, they can be able to keep people from using it, keep them off their land because they got the right to it now. Instead of commons land, it's their land. But of course, this would lead to an efficient result, but it would not be a particularly equitable one, because it used to be the case that everyone had a piece of this land, and now it just belongs to one person. So there's a tension there sometimes between efficiency and equality. Using the land most effectively might not be the same result as using it in a way that makes sure that everyone shares in it equally, at least in this sort of case. So let's go to our last kind of good. Some goods are both non-excludable and non-rival. These are called public goods. Now think about what this means, right? They're non-excludable. You can't keep people from using it once you've made it. You can't make them pay for it. It's also non-rival, which means that at least few, if we can't stop them from using it, at least they're not using it up for everybody else, which seems like it would be okay, but actually it leads to another kind of problem, which is that it's hard to actually get anybody to make these public goods. Think about it. Think about if you are thinking about, well, will I produce this public good so that everybody can use it? Well, you're not going to be able to get paid back for it, right? Because you can't force anybody to pay for it to use it, which means that you're going to put all this effort into creating this public good, and you're going to be on the hook for all of the costs, but you're only going to get the benefit that you get. You're only going to get how much you enjoy getting out of it, even though most of the benefits are going to other people because everybody gets to use it. A public good is sort of like a good that's almost entirely external benefit. Let's take, for example, national defense. We mentioned before. National defense is an example of a public good because you can't stop people from being nationally defended. If I have an army, I can't direct them to allow you to get invaded because I paid my taxes and you didn't, right? That's not how it works. It can't work that way. Because it's non-excludable. And so that is a problem, right? So so let's say that you live in a country where there's no national defense, and you think, well, I wish that I was nationally defense. I wish we had some national defense, and so I know let's start an army. And so you think, okay, is it going to be worth it for me to get an army started? Well, it's really expensive to start an army. It's really expensive, and if you're the only one paying for it, if you can't get anybody else to pay for it with you, then you're going to be on the hook for all of that cost. But you're only going to get defended the same as everybody else. Everyone else is going to do what's called free riding, where they are hoping that somebody else will produce the good and they'll just be able to get the benefits. If you've ever been in a class project before where someone seemed to be slacking off, that was an example of free riding. They were hoping that somebody else would provide the good of the nice graded project, and they would just be able to get the benefits without paying any of the costs. What this means is that typically, unsurprisingly, public goods tend to have inefficiently low production if they are produced in a competitive market. So if you tried to get the national defense produced in a competitive market where people were buying and selling on the basis of their personal marginal benefits and marginal costs, they would not be producing enough of it, right? Unsurprisingly. And typically the way that these goods are produced is by the government. Public goods are largely the domain of the government because they have the ability to force people to pay for them. Right? The reason we can have an army is because the government has the ability to force people to pay for them, essentially. Right? It's sort of a way of getting around the excludability thing. If they can force you to pay taxes, they can force you to pay for these public goods that themselves you can't stop people from using just because they haven't paid for them. And so things like bridges and infrastructure and national defense are provided by the government because they are public goods. Another good example is things like street lights, right? I can't stop you from looking at the light that the street light provides just because you haven't paid for it. But also you looking at this street light does not make there be less light left over for somebody else. So it's a public good, and unsurprisingly, street lights are typically provided by the government because they have the ability to make it worthwhile because they can recognize that this will benefit many, many people. And go on that basis rather than just thinking about the benefits of yourself. If you lived on a dark street, you might think, well, should I put up a street light? Well, it would be beneficial to you, certainly, but would it be so beneficial to make it worthwhile paying the thousands of dollars to put up the street light? Whereas the government can realize, well, it might only be worth a couple dollars to you, but there are thousands of people that will get to use it, and so it will be worthwhile overall, so it's worth it to build, even if no individual person would provide it. Which is why public goods are typically not provided in a competitive market because it doesn't work that well. So to sort of recap this excludability rivalry thing, Excludable and rival risk goods are what are called private goods. They're the standard type of goods we've been covering. Things that are excludable but not rival risk are called artificially scarce. These will either be underproduced because we're going to be able to set a high price for them, even though the efficient price is 0, or we could set up a paywall where we get you to pay up front to get you to access many different units of it at a low price. We also have non-excludable but rival risk goods. These are common goods. These tend to get overproduced as everybody scrambles to get a piece before it goes away. And then finally, we have non-excludable and non-rival risk goods, public goods, which are typically underproduced because you can't basically get people to pay for it, and so many of the benefits go to other people. These are typically provided by the government. Now, these are all examples of, except for private goods, of things that end up with market failures, where the market does not produce the efficient quantity. Similarly with externalities, where the market does not produce an efficient quantity. What do we do with this? Well, these are often justifications for regulation. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you ask an economist if a market is in need of regulation, often they will look and see if any of these particular features are in play. And if so, that is justification to regulate the market, assuming that you can get the regulation right, which is its own tricky problem. We're not going to go into the details of how that particular little wicket works, but rest assured, there are economists working on it as we speak. Maybe take a couple policy courses as you go on in your economics education. All right, but that is as far as we will take it today. Thank you very much, and when we come back, we'll be talking about pricing power, which is when we have a market that is not competitive at all. And we'll see how that works. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.